Good afternoon, and welcome to yet another extremely topical and extremely timely AMET webinar. On January 19th, 2021, when sitting before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for his confirmation hearing, Secretary of State Antony Blinken promised a, quote, longer, stronger deal with Iran. This is a sentiment that President Biden has echoed several times. Yet, as many of you are by now aware, when the American emissary to the talks, Robert Mallory, arrived in Vienna, he was told that he was not even allowed in the room with the negotiators. He therefore allowed the Russian emissary under Vladimir Putin to be our water carrier in the talks. I think that by now, most of the world clearly understands that Russia under Vladimir Putin is not exactly an ally of the United States. Yet, while Putin was announcing to the world his intentions to invade Ukraine and inflict upon Europe the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II, and as this horrific war is being executed by Russia in Ukraine, we have subcontracted our negotiations to the Russian emissary, Mikhail. That is why I consider this highly irresponsible diplomacy or even diplomatic malpractice. I know that by now, many of you have seen the video that's made its way around the internet, but I would like those of you who have seen it to bear with me for this very short video where the Russian emissary, Mikhail is positively gloating about the concessions that he was able to extract from the United States during these sensitive negotiations, together with his colleague from China. Naomi?
Iranian colleagues are fighting for Iranian nuclear national interests like lions. Indeed, I'm very serious. They fight for every comma, every word. And as a rule, quite successfully. I must recognize that.
Do you think that this could be a good deal for Iran, because there have been different arguments inside the
I'm absolutely sincere in this regard. Iran got much more than it could expect. Much more. Realistically speaking, Iran got more than, frankly, I expected, others expected. This is a matter of fact. Our Chinese friends were also very efficient and useful as co-negotiators. We could rely on each other on many points. And on many points, through joint efforts, we succeeded. I can recollect dozens of such cases when on rather serious, significant questions, we managed together to get positive results, close to what we wanted to achieve.
Thank you. We at AMET believe very strongly in the United States Constitution and in Article 2, Section 3, which talks about the responsibility of Congress for oversight. We also know, as you do, that Iran constitutes the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, and that the regime poses a clear and imminent danger to the security interests of the state of Israel and to our allies in the Gulf, and that the regime will eventually, if let unchecked, constitute a major threat to the national security interests of the United States and the liberal world order, with the United States at its helm, and will wreak havoc on the nuclear non-proliferation program in the Middle East. All of these talks have been surrounded by an atmosphere of secrecy and have been negotiated behind hermetically sealed closed doors. One question remains: if these negotiations were so helpful to the United States and her allies, why is there no transparency? Yesterday, news got out that yet another person has resigned from the American negotiating team in Vienna, Ambassador Dan Shapiro, because of the grave risk this deal puts on our national security interests and those of our colleagues. None of the details of any of these talks would be known to the world today without the incredibly courageous actions of today's guest, Gabriel Naranjo. Gabriel had formerly been with the Iran desk at the Department of State, and in early March, many of his former colleagues at State, at the National Security Council, and at the European Union were so aghast at the degree of concessions that were offered to the Iranians that they had contacted him in the hope that he would get the word out to the world. And indeed, he has. Gabriel's March 4th Twitter feed, as well as his excellent March 7th article in Tablet magazine, have made their way around the world. And we have used this very valuable information at AMET to help inform Congress of what precisely has been negotiated away in Vienna if these talks are successful. So it's now indeed my profound honor and pleasure to introduce you to Gabriel Naranjo, who I believe is an American hero. Gabriel had served as special advisor for Iran in the U.S. Department of State from 2019 to 2020. He previously worked in the U.S. Senate from 2015 to 2019, including on the Senate Armed Services Committee for Chairman John McCain and for Senator Jim Inhofe. So, Gabe, let's start from the beginning. Tell us about some of these very lovely people that the United States is considering lifting sanctions on.
Thanks for having me, Sarah, and appreciate you hosting me, and for everyone who's tuning in. Look, I worked on Iran for over 2 years at the State Department, and I've been following the negotiations really closely. And for most of this time, I'd heard sort of privately through career people at the State Department across the U.S. government just how concerned they were with what was happening in the negotiations. And they weren't sure what was going to happen, whether it was going to go through, but they just sort of said this is really bad. And earlier this month, it appeared that the talks were about to close, that they were only a few days from closing, and they said the American people need to know what's happening here. And Congress has to stop this because it is sort of just madness. And so some of what's happening in the deal is in the 2015 JCPOA, they lifted a lot of sanctions on Iran's trade, on their oil sales. But what they said was that the United States was free to impose consequences on Iran for terrorism, for human rights, for ballistic missiles. And so even though President Trump withdrew from the deal totally, he also worked to impose lots of other sanctions on Iran for its wide range of nefarious activity throughout the region, for its terrorism, for its brutal treatment of the Iranian people, and for their ballistic missile program, which threatens Israel, which threatens Saudi Arabia, Iraq, you name it. Almost every country in the region's been a victim of Iran's ballistic missiles. And so what was really concerning is that in the deal that's about to be finalized, the United States is preparing to lift sanctions on some of the regime's worst terrorists, some of their worst human rights offenders, and some of the parts of the regime which are most responsible for funding and carrying out and executing Iran's terrorism across the world and their brutal treatment of the Iranian people. So some of the worst terrorists are folks like Mohsen Rezaian, who was actually Qasem Soleimani's predecessor as the commander of the Quds Force. Mohsen Rezaian was also responsible for the Amia bombing in 1994 in Argentina that left over 85 Jews and Argentinians dead. He would be released from sanctions. So would Ali Akbar Veliati, who is called the mastermind of the attack. He'd be freed from sanctions. Both of them are under Interpol's red notice still today. And yet the United States would basically unfreeze their foreign assets, allow them to travel abroad, even basically taking them off the visa ban that could, in theory, allow them to come and travel to the United States. They're lifting sanctions on folks like the IRGC's Brigadier General Degani, who was responsible for the IRGC's forces in Lebanon when Hezbollah bombed the Beirut barracks in 1983. left over 240 Americans and 58 French soldier service members dead. He was basically the way to look at it is he's basically the one responsible for that bombing itself. He would be set free from sanctions. And then some of the regime's most brutal masterminds of their repression of Iranians. That includes their current president, who is who's one of the judges responsible for the death commissions in Iran in the 1980s, where he sentenced over 5,000 Iranians to death personally. They were hung from cranes, every 30 minutes, just on rotation, basically. And there was of course, no fair warning for them. He would be, this is President Raisi, he'd be freed from sanctions. Judges, other judges who volunteered to go to prisons, basically to go serve as executioners, they would be free. And so these are some of the worst, just really awful human beings who deserve, they deserve far worse punishment than sanctions. But sanctions are sort of the only real mechanism the United States has, short of taking military action, to provide a semblance of justice for the victims of these things. And so I see a question from in the chat. So these were all sanctioned under the Supreme Leader's Office sanctions. So those sanctions took away any foreign holdings they had, prevented them from traveling to the United States. And a lot of these officials are top regime officials. They've enriched themselves massively through confiscating property from Iranians, often from Jews, from Baha'is, and from political dissidents. They'll just take their houses, sell their property, sell their assets, and use it to enrich themselves. There's also huge amounts of the regime's sort of slush funds, hedge funds that belong to Supreme Leader Khamenei himself, worth tens of billions, maybe even hundreds of billions of dollars. Again, mostly taken illicitly from innocent Iranians in the Islamic Revolution and in the decades since then. The United States had sanctioned those entities as well because they operated like Khamenei's personal wealth fund. He could direct the money wherever he wanted, send it anywhere. And also Supreme Leader Khamenei himself was sanctioned under these under this. Khamenei's personal sins are very, he's been in power for over 3 decades now, and he's committed vast number of sins in that time. The one that is most personal to me is there was reporting from 3 years ago when he personally ordered his henchmen to go on the streets and massacre as many Iranians as was necessary to keep his power alive. And so the regime murdered over 1,500 Iranians in cold blood. Unfortunately, I was the head of Iran, the Human Rights Division at the State Department then for Iran. And so I personally was watching the videos, combing through them and coming through the details, and saw just how brutally the Iranian security forces killed their protesters. And so that one was the fact that we will release Khamenei himself from sanctions after he committed such vile acts is really reprehensible to me, just as a moral question, that the United States would deem it morally reasonable to release him from sanctions. There's political questions of, okay, we can do this and that for nuclear questions, which we can get into. But on a personal level, for that to be sort of a moral stance that you can do is really, I think, very dangerous. Now, I'm happy to go into some of the more the financial sanctions and some of those things, but I don't know if you have other questions you want to get to, Sarah, since I'm going in quite great detail here.
Great. Okay. I know that because of the war in Ukraine, President Biden has been trying to make Vladimir Putin feel a bit of a consequence or pain by hermetically sealing off oil trade from Russia. And we are even considering sanctioning China for the oil trade with Russia. Yet the Iranians and Russians want to try it in oil as well as in nuclear energy. The Russian nuclear power company, Rosatom, which was responsible for the seizure and dangerous attack and consequent blaze of the Ukrainian nuclear plant Zizia, I can't pronounce it, the largest power plant in Europe, as well as Chernobyl. Also, they want to deal with them. Yet, it seems that we are enabling Iran to trade with Russia. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, said that it has received written guarantees from the United States over this. And apparently, Secretary of State Tony Blinken has dismissed these Russian demands to deal with Iran in oil and nuclear energy as not related to the situation in Ukraine. Can you comment on this?
Look, the reality is they're directly interlinked. So there's two questions. There's sort of the oil and the trade between Russia and Iran, which enriches both Iran and Russia at a time when both regimes are seeking basically to undermine the West and our world order, which is on its face troubling. And then there's the question of the nuclear cooperation, which is even worse. So as you mentioned, Rosatom it's Russia's state nuclear energy corporation. Basically, the state came and took over all of it. And the head of Rosatom reports directly to Vladimir Putin. He meets with him regularly and talks about everything. And so Rosatom was used by the Russian military to help take over the Chernobyl plant, the Zaporizhzhia plant, which is the largest nuclear facility in all of Europe. But at the same time, Russia was trying to get sanctions immunity for Rosatom because Rosatom also is involved in nuclear work in Iran. And they were afraid that the United States might use that as reason to sanction Rosatom. What I actually found, I speak Russian as well as Mandarin, is I was going through Rosatom's documents and found that they had a $10 billion contract for future work in Iran. And so that's what Putin and Lavrov were really eager to protect because Rosatom is going to be on a very precarious financial footing now that they're, have shown their true colors and their involvement in this war. And so a $10 billion economic lifeline is very valuable. And so that's what the Russians demanded from the United States as a guarantee for this deal to go through, is that that deal can go through unscathed, unscrutinized from U.S. sanctions. And it appears that that's exactly what they got, which I think is more evidence that Russia is using this deal purely to advance its own interests. I think most of the folks on this webinar, a few, I think, missed it, the video of the Russian ambassador crowing about how they got all these wins and how they worked with China to sort of defeat the United States at the negotiating table. That's what this deal has been about for them this whole time. Russia doesn't particularly care one way or the other about Iran's nuclear program. They're not the target of it. But what they're looking at is how can we reshape the world order in ways that are beneficial to Russia and in ways that are detrimental to the United States and our interests. And so that's ultimately what motivated like Mikhail Ulyanov. I follow him on Twitter. About a quarter of his posts are about Iran and the nuclear deal. Right now, the rest of them are all him defending Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's him spreading lies about, fake biological weapons programs. It's lies about Ukraine being full of Nazis. He is one of the regime's top propagandists in Vienna at the UN missions there. He's one of their top propagandists, period. So it's sort of shocking that we do regular business with him. We've empowered him in these negotiations to advance Russia's interests, and I think earlier you used the word diplomatic malpractice. That's the definition of what's happening in this whole deal from start to finish. It's the amount of concessions we've made both at a technical level and then geopolitically how we're reshaping the world is very detrimental to U.S. national security interests, to Israel's national security, but also just the Middle East instability in the region writ large. What we're doing is we're essentially saying we want Iran to not enrich uranium above certain limit for 9 years. And when that happens, you're saying, okay, we hope you won't get a nuclear weapon for 9 years. In return, we'll give you $90 billion in access to the regime's funds that have been frozen. Will allow you to conduct terrorism wherever you want, will allow you to trade wherever you want, will allow you to buy weapons from Russia and China and sell them to the Houthis in Yemen and to Hezbollah and Hamas wherever you want. And so it's this deal with the devil. You get some concessions on your nuclear program for a brief period. In return, you get the world, and that's really what we're seeing here. Russia will be enormously empowered by the trade as well. They haven't had a lot of trade previously, but with U.S. sanctions taken off, that's going to skyrocket, and that's really dangerous for U.S. interests on both sides, both the Russia side and the Iran side.
Okay, Gabe, can you comment a little bit about the new Iranian budget and how much of this money is going to go to the IRGC and what some of the IRGC's activities are?
Yeah, so and as a little bit of a preview and some context for folks who don't pay attention to the Iranian budget a lot. So their new fiscal year just started last week because that's where their new year starts. And under the maximum pressure campaign on Iran during the Trump administration, we saw the IRGC budgets drop 28% in 1 year, double digits the next year. Basically, they didn't have the money to fund their terror operations anymore. And so historically, they would fund Hezbollah about 700 million a year, Hamas about 100 million a year. And they had to stop huge amounts of these payments. So even to the New York Times and Washington Post, these fighters were complaining and saying, hey, we're losing our jobs. We're losing our healthcare. We're being furloughed, which is the best thing you can possibly hear for peace in the Middle East. And that is what the maximum pressure campaign was designed to do. It was designed to really reshape the Middle East by just preventing them from being able to fund their terror programs. What happened when President Biden took office was that he stopped enforcing U.S. sanctions on Iran's oil trade and really on any of their economic activity throughout the world where they were trying to evade sanctions. And so what happened is their economies boomed by around 5% in the past year. It's hard to pinpoint exactly how much. And they've been able to resume their support for terrorism. If you look at their budget, they spent $13 billion on what they call security, which is terrorism, largely domestic repression. And what they were able to do this year with the new funds was they increased support for the IRGC's security budget by I believe, 386%. That's shocking, a shocking amount. That is, again, all going to go to support for terror proxies, support for the IRGC at home to enrich themselves. They increased funding for this program, another program called the Shahid program, by over 300%. That in the past has been used to buy safe houses where they tortured political prisoners, dissidents. It's a little murky, all the details, but it's really dangerous stuff. The MOIS, which has been responsible for trying to kidnap an American citizen, Masih al-Nijad, from her home in Brooklyn, that was increased by over 30%. They're working to assassinate my old boss, Brian Hook, my old boss, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, and other current and former top U.S. diplomats and generals currently on U.S. soil is what the MOIS and IRGC are working to do. And so what's happened recently is they've had their budget increase massively. So that allows them to conduct these terror operations. That allows them to plot kidnapping, send money, send weapons across the region. That's why these financial sanctions have been so important, because we stopped them from being able to do so much of that previously, and now they're back at it and they have more money now than ever. And if this deal goes through, they'll get $90 billion to supercharge that.
Have you ever, in your knowledge of history or vast knowledge, seen a precedent where there are American former members of an administration, legislators, policymakers, who are at risk of being kidnapped by a regime, and not kidnapped, executed on our own soil, yet we are negotiating with them and preparing to make such a generous deal with them? I
was thinking about that, and I was trying to rack through, did the Soviet Union do this? Did China do this? Did North Korea do this? You may have instances where those regimes have sought to do things like that on limited scales, but you never saw them try to assassinate maybe even as many as a dozen top U.S. officials, from President, from secretaries of state, General Milley, and who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is allegedly on that list. Again, these are the top officials, not just an annoying dissident here and there. So that is unprecedented. And what's unprecedented is that we would seek to reward that regime with massive concessions while they are still trying to do that. And so, from all the accounts I've received from diplomats, is there's no restriction on their terror activity. And I have no indication to believe that they have any intention of stopping those assassination plots. And just recently, there was a report that the United States government is spending $10 million just on protection of those officials. So we're spending money to protect officials, but we're giving money to the regime, which we now know from the budgets is being used to supercharge those assassination efforts.
It's a brand new definition of insanity. So I would like also for you to comment before I hand this over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who will read and field some of the questions that have come in. Many people have said, is there anything that we can do to stop this horrific deal?
So there are a couple of things that I've been working very closely with Congress on this. I used to work there. I have many contacts there. Look, there's two things. One, ultimately, this is a political question for the Biden administration. They will do this because they believe that they can get away with it, and they think that no one will really pay attention to it because of the Russia war. And if they feel that there is sort of a political cost to doing this, all bets are off. And so one of the things that that I also disclosed, which I wasn't even able to get to, is that the United States is considering lifting the IRGC, Iran's terrorism arm, from the list of foreign terrorist organizations, which would be an incredible concession. That sanction prevents members of the IRGC from entering the United States, from staying in the United States, which makes a lot of sense when they're trying to assassinate our top officials. So if you lift that sanction, you basically take away the restriction from terrorists entering our country. When I released that got members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, to be clear, extremely angry, and they sent a flurry of letters and demanded meetings from the administration. It appears that put some hesitation into the administration, realizing, okay, that's not going to be a easy or perhaps prudent and wise decision. So that may have delayed, that certainly did delay negotiations significantly, because that was the final issue on the table. And now it appears that's complicated negotiations. And so for, what can you, our participants do? You can call your member of Congress and say, hey, what are you doing about this? Why aren't you concerned? Have you voiced this to the administration? In terms of what Congress can do, there is a mechanism where Congress can force back sanctions on this regime. They can do that through existing law, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015, which was passed to basically try to prevent the old deal. And they can pass new law and say that the sanctions we have on Iran are not, you can't suspend them, you can't get rid of them. We're going to mandate sanctions against the IRGC, against Iran's top terror financing banks and institutions. So those are things that Congress is looking at doing. Republicans particularly, but also some Democrats, have basically pledged that they will work to undo all these sanctions concessions. They've pledged to try to enforce sanctions against Russia, Russia's nuclear enterprise and other Russian entities. And so those are really important, because the executive branch is just one part of the US government. They're the most important part when it comes to national security policy, but Congress has a voice. They are important, and but the issue is they need to make their voice heard. Very often Congress is very deferential to the executive branch. That's very difficult to do. And it requires leadership from the top down. And I think my story did alert Congress, and they got very worked up about it, which I was very happy to see. And that's ultimately why members of the executive branch were disclosing these details. They said the executive branch is not a responsible party on this. Congress needs to come in and exert its oversight authority and its responsibility, because our branch is not even doing our own job, and it's not helping the American people.
Exactly, exactly. And that is why we are so preeminently grateful to you, Gabriel, because we at AMET have been working vociferously, alerting Congress to all the details that your friends and former colleagues at state have let you know as to why this is just an assault on the national security interests of the United States and our allies. And with that, I want to turn the podium over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who will field some of the questions that have come in and probably pose some of his own. Hussein?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you very much, Gabriel, for such a timely disclosure of very important information. I think on behalf of myself and our audience, we're very grateful to you. We've received a lot of questions, as you may imagine, about this very important and timely issue. So I'm going to try to combine a lot of the questions together. I apologize to our audiences ahead that it's very obvious that I'm not going to be able to cover all of these questions, but I will try to get to as many of them as possible. And because of the broad range of the questions we received, Gabriel, feel free if there's a question that you feel is out of your area of expertise, or you don't want, or you don't think you can answer, feel free to say so. So the first group of questions that were received is actually asking about what is driving the Biden administration, and before that the Obama administration, to behave this way. Do you have any insight to the logic that is driving this administration that is, from our side, seems to be completely illogical? Do you have any insight of what do they think their end game is? What are they trying to achieve? How does this make sense from their own point of view?
Sure, and I will try to be fair to what I believe they actually believe. I don't want to, I'm not going to cast unfair aspersions. I'll leave that to others, where I believe some of these aspersions are accurate. Look, I think there's two central themes that they are trying to do. One, they are legitimately afraid that Iran is approaching close to a nuclear weapon. And what they want to do is they want to buy more time. And so in the original JCPOA, it bought 15 years. It bought 15 years of Iranian low enrichment. But what it did, and this is, again, most of it, the critics are so concerned, is it allows at 2031, Iran to immediately acquire a nuclear weapon free of US sanctions. So when that happens, they have no restriction. In 2031, there are no restrictions on Iran's enrichment level, their volume, how advanced centrifuges they can have. And so they'd only be weeks away from a nuclear weapon at that point, free of US sanctions. So in that time, they can build an economy powerful enough to sustain sanctions, to sustain military attack, because they could buy weapons systems from, say, Russia or China to defend against an Israeli or US attack. But again, to be fair to the administration, they want to buy more time. They want to buy more time because they think we need to spend more resources on Russia and China and not on Iran. That's what I generously believe that they view. I think that's very misguided for a number of reasons, but that's their view. The second one, and this is where I think they are incredibly misguided, is they really want to reshape the Middle East. They don't believe that we should cast our lot with Israel. They don't believe that we should be partners with countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE and others who are imperfect. But what they have sought to do is to reshape the Middle East into one where Iran could potentially be a partner. And Iran would balance against Israel and the Saudis and the Emiratis and others in the Gulf world. That is ridiculous. The country that chants death to America, and its real core guiding principle is antagonism with the West, the destruction of Israel, and the establishment of a global Islamic caliphate. I don't think such an entity can be bargained with, can be balanced, can reach any sort of work with. Now, the Obama administration believed, and I don't think the Biden administration does, that Iran could be moderated. They believed that if you empowered the more moderate voices, which to me is sort of like saying empowering the more moderate Bolsheviks, there isn't one, they don't exist, that you could eventually shape the regime towards one that would eventually give up some of its ideals. That was a fantasy, it was wishful thinking, and both in the Obama years and in the Trump years, that was just proven that that was a farce, it wasn't going to happen. I don't believe the Biden administration believes that anymore. I think they sort of realized, okay, that was actually wishful thinking, it's not true. They understand that the deal that they are working on now is not as good as the last one. They know it, they'll admit it. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see so many Democrats saying, hey, this does not make sense. And it's one of the reasons you have so many career and political appointees. Keep in mind, 2 and now 3 political appointees have resigned, at least 2 of them in full protest of the policy. So these aren't conservative dissenters, these aren't career dissenters, these are political appointees saying this doesn't make sense. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. I think this is actually an excellent answer. One of the best answers I've personally heard. Since you actually just mentioned the political appointees, that's actually we received a lot of questions about that specifically, the ones who resigned in protest. So this issue, those stories, do you think the departure of those members of the teams in protest will have any effect on the outcome? Can that persuade the administration? I mean, can't the administration tell that the people on our side are resigning in protest? Can this alter their behavior in any way?
I wish it were the case. I don't believe it is, because what it's done is it's sort of left the more, I'll use the term radical, and I don't think it's misplaced in this context, the more radical members of the negotiating team in power without dissenters in their midst. Basically, they said, we're being bulldozed, we're not even being listened to, so we're not going to be part of this. And the remaining folks, led by Rob Malley, and there's other folks who I don't feel the need to name, are sort of saying, great, okay, our opponents are gone, we'll take over and do it from here. Now you have career folks who are trying to hold the line internally, but they ultimately don't have power. And so what it has done, though, is it has told folks in Congress, okay, these are our friends who resigned, we trust their judgment. If they're in their judgment, this is crazy enough to resign over, we need to take a look at this. And so I think I don't think it's changed the view of the top leadership in the executive branch, but I think it is changing minds in the Congress.
Thank you. We've received multiple questions about INARA and about whether the administration is planning to circumvent the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act and try to circumvent the U.S. Congress actively, if you know that they are actively trying to find ways to circumvent the U.S. Congress.
So the quick answer is yes, they are trying to find ways to actively circumvent INARA and circumvent Congress. What they are trying to do is claim that they are going back into the old JCPOA. And under their logic, they're saying it's been reviewed once, we don't need to have it reviewed twice because it's the same deal. Now that's completely a farce on its face, because this new deal is not the old JCPOA. The conditions on the ground have completely changed. Iran's nuclear program has completely changed, and our sanctions program has completely changed. And so the text is completely different. So that's sort of a legal farce. But basically, they've asked their lawyers, what grounds do we have to avoid giving this to Congress? It's unclear to me how far they are willing to go on that. And the issue with INARA is it didn't provide a very good recourse for Congress. If the executive branch just said, we're not doing it, what are you going to do? It didn't give Congress the tools to say it's blocked automatically. Now, there are certain things Congress could sue. If the executive branch refuses to submit it, members of Congress could sue based on the grounds that they have been deprived of their vote, that they are entitled to a vote under the law and they are being deprived of it, they could sue. and I saw a question in the chat, which was, what happens if Iran gets the $90 billion? What recourse does Congress have then? And there's none. Once Iran gets its money, which happens once you start unsanctioning the banks, there's nothing you can do to stop it. Congress can't do it. You've just given the terrorists the money and they will go run with it. And so that's one of the dangerous things that I was trying to warn in my op-ed is, one of the things that would happen is that they were trying to release a huge set of sanctions before Congress would be notified or could do anything about it at all. And that would allow Iran access to tens of billions of dollars without Congress even having the ability to review it. That would be illegal, it would be illegitimate, and Congress could and should sue over it. But again, it would be too late. And that's one of the reasons that people were in the executive branch were very upset, and I got very upset as well.
Thank you. During the 2015, the original JCPOA negotiations, the Obama administrations and Obama officials, they went to great lengths and they were at pains to say that negotiations, the deal, it's just strictly and only about the Iranian nuclear program, terrorism, ballistic missiles, human rights, all of that. That's something completely different. We're not going to talk about any of that. We're just going to focus on this. This seems to be suddenly changing. All of a sudden, we hear about the delisting of the RGC as a possibility. The administration is talking about things, or in Vienna, they are talking about things not directly related to the nuclear programs. What changed, and how does the Biden administration justify this change of course?
So I think the proper way to do it is, we are only asking about Iran's nuclear program. The Iranians are asking about everything else we have done. And we are making concessions on the terrorism file. We are making concessions on the human rights file and the ballistic missile file. But they are only making minor concessions on the nuclear side. And that's what's very worrying. So the Iranians, even though the IRGC designation had nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program, they demanded that it be lifted. And the US is trying to get a pledge in return from Iran saying, we promise not to target Americans and do bad things in the Middle East, which is like, I don't know, asking a cow not to make milk. I don't understand how you can ask a terrorist group to stop conducting terrorism. It'd be a joke. But yes, so the short answer to your question is, we are only asking for nuclear concessions, but Iran is using the opportunity to ask for everything far beyond the nuclear file in terms of concessions to the United States. And so far, we've been giving them to Iran. A year from now, there would be 0 restrictions on Iran's ballistic missile program. So a year from now, they can buy long-range ballistic missiles from Russia, from China, which could be used to target Israel, but could also go as far as Europe, maybe even as far as the United States. That happens a year and a half from now under the JCPOA, and still under this new deal that is being negotiated.
Thank you. We received a couple of questions asking about how a lot of those individuals that were now afraid that they're going to be sanctions. It said that they were sanctioned under the Trump administration in 2018, whether Degani on other people. How were they kept in check before the Trump administration imposed sanctions on those bodies and individuals?
In many cases, they weren't kept in check. In many cases, they were traveling freely to Europe, to the United States. A lot of their kids go to college in the United States and Europe. And so they were basically enjoying the full benefits of being in the West, of being a civilized country, while they were engaged in entirely uncivilized behavior. And it took some time for us to, identify everyone, to sanction everyone, and impose consequences on them. For a long time, they had gotten free on this idea that they were just a country trying to pursue their own interests, so they weren't really a terrorist organization. I don't agree with every single thing they did, but one thing that I'll credit President Trump and Secretary Pompeo with is they really saw the regime for what it was, that it was a terrorist organization masquerading as a nation, not the other way around.
Thank you. Also, we have a couple of questions asking also feel free not to answer this or give us the insight that you have. Why hasn't been media coverage of this? This seems to be something of extreme importance to the American public, and what's going on in the media today is just a complete. You know how it is, just discussing very banal and irrelevant issues, while something like this is not getting any coverage.
So I think it's an important question. I have a lot of friends who are journalists, and I try to give them benefit of the doubt sometimes. There's a degree to which, part of this is a reflection on news media. ABC News no longer has 10 foreign correspondents where they can actually cover the details and dive into this. So I'll be a little generous there and say they're overworked, and they don't also try to dig in to things. If this were the Trump again, I don't like everything about President Trump, but if this were the Trump administration over Russia, you would see every journalist on there, digging up every detail. I wish there were as much scrutiny over this deal. And look, a lot of the details that I talked about, and even more, have been out there in the open for any journalists willing to look into it and publish them. The Iranians published a lot of this. I recently just found out the Iranians published a lot of this in Farsi. And it was just out there in the public domain, and no reporter bothered to check on it. And so I don't think they're doing their job properly, is the short answer. I don't think they understand the nature of this issue and how important it is. And I think you have a lot of folks who just carry the administration's water, who are ideologically biased and refuse to admit that they're biased and refuse to report on any concession accordingly. It's just, I don't think it's bad for journalists to be biased. We're all humans, we're all biased, but I think it's a disservice to the American public when we refuse to report on the unsavory and dirty details of a deal that doesn't advance U.S. national security interests.
Thank you. I definitely agree with you there, but it's not just Farsi. I mean, what you wrote and you put out, Gabriel, has been now there out there for weeks, and extremely upsetting to see that mostly it's reported by Jewish media, and a lot of the mainstream media is completely ignoring this. We have a couple of questions actually about military issues. So. Again, we know that this might not be your area of expertise, but hopefully you can give us any insight that you have. Is there still any credible military option available for the United States to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, or any military option that we have just directly risks our on-ground engagement and wider confrontations with Iran?
So I'll be a little careful in how I respond, because some of this is sensitive and some of this is complicated enough that I won't. I think it's complicated and I don't know every detail. A short answer is, it is very unlikely there would ever be a ground invasion of Iran to destroy Iran's nuclear program. That's a disaster. Iran's conventional capabilities are far more advanced than Iraq's were. This isn't a good idea, and the American public has no interest in a land war in the Middle East again. In terms of basically the remaining main military option is an airstrike on Iran's nuclear facilities. The United States has capabilities to conduct this, but it would much prefer that Israel do it, because Israel is the one with more skin in the game. And Israel is preparing and has long been preparing to have the ability to conduct these activities themselves, partly because they know that they can't count on the United States to do something that is more in Israel's interest than it is in the United States' interest. My belief, but I wouldn't take this with 100% certainty, is that Israel could do it. What would likely happen, though, is that Hezbollah has 100,000 rockets and missiles, which it has acquired mostly from Iran. And when that happens, the implication is that Hezbollah would launch those in a war against Israel. And so this is a break glass in case of emergency option for Israel to take. It would not be without cost. It would spark a war. It would almost certainly spark a war with Iran through Iran's proxies, maybe through Iranian military assets themselves. So it's a drastic measure. One thing that I think it's important for the audience to know, when you hear all these talking points in the administration, Iran's about to get a bomb. And you'll hear this from some senators who know better, and you'll hear this from the administration. There are two separate nuclear timelines. There's the enrichment timeline, where currently Iran is probably about a month away from having the material for the nuclear material for a weapon. So basically enough weapons grade uranium. But there's a completely separate timeline called its weaponization timeline. Basically, can you create a weapon that actually explodes? Could you create a weapon that actually could be put on a missile? The CIA and the Director of National Intelligence and the Israeli officials have all said that Iran is not currently engaged in weaponization activity. And the Israelis have indicated it's a 1 to 2 year timeline once that process starts to actually get a fully functional weapon. So when you hear the headlines of, oh, we must have a deal or Iran will get a nuclear weapon, take it with a massive grain of salt, because at the same time they are saying that Iran is weeks away from a nuclear weapon, they're quietly telling Congress, actually, we don't even really see any weaponization activity, and it would take a year to 2 years. So that's something that people who will try to pull the wool over people's eyes because they assume that most Americans don't know nuclear weaponization procedures, and it's a very complicated topic in the first place.
Thank you. We received a number of questions. This has been going on in the pro-Israel and the Jewish community for quite some time, and I think it's important to voice this question out because a lot of people ask it. People have been feeling for quite some time that there is a clear anti-Israel bias in the Biden administration, and before that, in the Obama administration. And it's not even so subtle. It's a clear bent that is coming out very strongly in the U.S. foreign policy against Israel in the Middle East. Do you agree on this? And of course, we received even questions that included charges of, are they anti-Semitic? Why are they doing this against Israel? What is your own thoughts about this?
I would be, so one, I think there's individuals and there are administrations. In any administration, you are going to have individuals who are very anti-Israel. You're going to have individuals who are anti-Semitic. I don't know what goes on in their minds. I'm not going to cast aspersions like that. I will say that Special Envoy Malley was kicked out of the Obama campaign in 2008 because of his ties to Hamas. In his meetings with them, there's video of him defending Hamas as a social organization with just charitable work, and so you can draw your conclusions accordingly there. In terms of an administration, it's been far less pro-Israel than the Trump administration. It sort of routinely attacks Israel for human rights violations, where it doesn't do that for Iran anymore. Let me tell you, there's no moral comparison between Israel and Iran. No country is perfect, but Iran is one of the most vicious, deadly, brutal, inhumane, and evil regimes that on the face of the earth today. And I wish we would treat it like that. I wish we would actually speak truth about the crimes they've committed and continue to commit, but sadly we aren't.
Thank you. This is an important question as well. I mean, all of the questions are really very important because of just how immensely crucial and vital the topic is. Is there hope in stopping the administration from signing this deal, or is this a done deal? The administration made up its mind. They're going to jump into this regardless of how much noise that we make.
Earlier this month, it was a 95% done deal. The Russia issue delayed it, and then when Congress found out about the lifting, about some of the details in this deal, and as well as the proposed lifting of the IRGC sanctions, they made this deal far more complicated and unlikely to pass. I still think it's probably a 75% chance this deal goes through, maybe 80%. And I would say part of it is partly due to human nature. Once you get this close to the finish line, you're going to make concessions to get to the rest of it. And the issue is that the Iranians know that the Americans really want a deal. And when that happens, it's really dangerous, because then it's like you're at a store, and when we've all been to, a rug store, clothing store where you're bartering. If you really want that rug, you're going to walk away with that rug. What you pay is going to get more expensive the more you show that you love that. That's exactly what's happening here, and our negotiators are being taken in for a spin.
Thank you, and I believe Senator Menendez said something to this meeting when he said that hope is not a national security strategy. There were a lot of reports about the activities of the IRGC in South America, and how they are extending the network and their relationships in South America, and they might even be moving ballistic missiles there. Does this not worry the current administration? What about the Pentagon or security agencies? How about our security apparatus? Nobody is worrying about this?
Let me comment very briefly from how we saw it in the Trump administration under Pompeo. This went very unnoticed, and I kept trying to get people to notice it when I was the communications director. We put out a statement to the press that we said, if Iran tries to send ballistic missiles to Venezuela or Cuba, we are prepared to eliminate them. Now, somehow that didn't make it into the press and no one paid attention to it. We were trying to put a lot of attention to that. So that is something that we are concerned about, or we're concerned about. Iran has been sending arms into Venezuela. They've been equipping Hezbollah and using Hezbollah as a drug running operation. You know, part of it is Hezbollah's working with the Maduro regime. The Maduro regime at this point is simply a drug. Maduro is a drug kingpin. And Hezbollah has turned into drug runners into Latin America to destabilize the continent and as a fundraising mechanism. And so we should be very concerned. I do not know now whether Iran is trying to put ballistic missiles in Venezuela. That would be classified. But they likely were looking to do so in the past. And the US military should be very concerned by that. There were previously Iranian warships headed to Venezuela. It's unclear what happened to that. A lot of it, the US didn't want to publicize, and because they don't want to show examples of Iranian malfeasance throughout the world. It's been a lot harder in this administration to get intelligence and public reporting on Iran's activities, because the administration doesn't want to highlight them because it's an inconvenient narrative.
Thank you. I want to apologize to all of our audiences that we're running out of time, and I'm not going to be able to get all of these questions. So I'm going to ask you one last question. We already talked about this many times, but just you can imagine how many questions we received about this. Robert Malley, Ali Fayez, all of those people who are leading the administration's negotiations in this. Do they truly represent the U.S. interest? Do they truly have the best U.S. interests in heart? Or what actually motivates them?
That's a difficult question. I do not know what lies in every man's heart. I can look at previous evidence, which leads me to suggest that I don't believe that Malley I'll phrase this carefully. I don't think he views U.S. national security interests nearly the way that most Americans and most national security experts would. That concerns me. I don't think he sees the Iranian regime's nature for what it is. I think he's far more willing to view them as victims than the United States. I think he views the United States as the aggressor and the bully, and the Iranian regime as a victim, and that we owe Iran something for everything we've done. I think that leads him to a very strange worldview, which has his worldview is a very extreme, radical one. I think it's one of the reasons that he's he wasn't given a Senate confirmed position. He was given a political appointeeship where he didn't have to be confirmed, because he wouldn't stand a chance in the Senate. Going through a rigorous process. Why he was chosen as the special envoy in face of significant and vocal pressure remains a mystery to me. I'm not normally in the business of impugning people's character and nature. I think what I'll say is this: I encourage the audience to look into his background more and make a determination for themselves. I've made my determination now.
Thank you so much, Gabe. I cannot possibly thank you enough for your amazing courage and your idealism, your intellectual honesty, and your moral integrity. It is because of you and your leaks that the world just knows a little bit about what's been happening behind closed doors in Vienna, and how this poses a clear and present danger to the survival of our ally Israel and our Sunni Gulf allies, and will eventually pose a horrible strategic national security risk for the United States. So I cannot thank you enough. I want to ask everyone in the audience to please call their member of Congress at 225-3121 and tell them that this deal must be stopped. And if you'd like, you can go onto our website and look at our action alerts. We have everything written down as to why this constitutes a grave threat for the United States and her allies. And your member of Senate is 202-224-3121. If you'd like, we can write out some talking points, some further talking points for you if you request that. Again, thank you so much, Gabe. And my hat goes off to you.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. Appreciate everyone who tuned in, and thank you all at EMET for doing very important work.
Thank you. Be well. Bye-bye now.